Ambassador Theron stepped off the transport shuttle and onto the surface of Earth for the first time. The air felt thick and heavy compared to his homeworld. Everything about this planet seemed excessive. The gravity pulled at his limbs, the atmosphere pressed against his chest, and the bright yellow star overhead burned with uncomfortable intensity. He had been a diplomat for the Galactic Concordance for nearly 30 cycles. This was his 9th assignment to a newly discovered species. The process was always the same. Arrive, assess their development, introduce them to basic galactic laws, establish trade agreements, and depart. Simple. Routine. Boring if he was honest with himself. The humans had sent a delegation to meet him at the landing site. A woman with graying hair and sharp eyes approached first, extending her hand in the peculiar human greeting ritual. Theron had studied their customs and awkwardly grasped her hand. Ambassador Theron, welcome to Earth. I'm Margaret Chin, appointed as your primary liaison during your stay. Theron nodded. Margaret led him to a ground vehicle. Humans still used wheeled transportation on their planet's surface, which Theron found charmingly primitive. As they drove through the city, he observed the chaotic sprawl of buildings, the streams of individual vehicles clogging roadways, and the masses of humans moving about their daily activities. How many governmental bodies will I need to meet with? Theron asked, reviewing his data pad. Margaret smiled slightly. Well, that depends on how thorough you want to be. There are 195 recognized nations on Earth, each with their own government. Theron's head snapped up. 195? But you have achieved faster-than-light travel. Most species consolidate into 5 or 6 unified governments before that technological threshold. We're not most species, Margaret replied with that same small smile. Over the following days, Theron met with representatives from dozens of human nations. He quickly noticed a pattern in their questions. While other species typically asked about trade opportunities, cultural exchange programs, or technological sharing agreements, humans asked different questions. A man named Robert, some sort of military official, asked detailed questions about the Concordance's defensive capabilities. How many ships in the fleet? What weapon systems did other species use? How did the Concordance resolve territorial disputes? We are a peaceful coalition, Theron explained carefully. Military conflict is rare. We prefer negotiation and compromise. But when negotiation fails? Robert pressed. What then? We make concessions. We find middle ground. War is wasteful and destructive. Robert nodded slowly, but Theron couldn't shake the feeling that the human found his answer somehow inadequate. Margaret invited Theron to tour a human spacecraft manufacturing facility. The engineer in charge, a cheerful man named David, showed him their latest faster-than-light vessel with obvious pride. Theron examined the ship's systems with barely concealed disappointment. The engine design was inefficient. The hull plating was half as thick as Concordance standards. The life support systems had redundancies, but they were crude and manual rather than automated. This is your most advanced vessel? Theron asked, trying to keep judgment from his voice. David grinned. She's not pretty, but she'll get you home even if half the systems fail. We build for reliability, not elegance. Theron frowned. But why would half the systems fail? Proper engineering prevents such scenarios. Proper engineering prepares for when things go wrong, David corrected. Because things always go wrong eventually. This philosophy baffled Theron. Concordance vessels were engineered to exacting standards specifically so systems would not fail. The human approach seemed to assume failure was inevitable and plan accordingly. It struck him as pessimistic and backward. Margaret seemed to enjoy introducing Theron to human culture. She took him to something called a boxing match, where 2 men climbed into a roped enclosure and systematically struck each other with padded fists. The crowd roared with approval at each landed blow. Theron watched in growing discomfort. Your species finds entertainment in combat? We find entertainment in testing limits, Margaret said. It's controlled, regulated, and both fighters choose to participate. Nobody's actually trying to kill anyone. But they are trying to hurt each other. They're trying to prove who's better, she corrected. There's a difference. Theron couldn't see the difference at all. The strangest experience came when Margaret invited him to watch a human film. She called it a classic, and seemed excited to share it. The movie depicted Earth being invaded by technologically superior aliens. The humans were outmatched, their cities destroyed, their military crushed. Yet somehow, through a combination of luck, desperation, and what Theron could only describe as suicidal bravery, the humans in the film discovered a weakness in the alien technology. They uploaded a computer virus, launched a coordinated global counterattack, and won. The audience in the theater cheered as the alien mothership exploded. Theron sat frozen in his seat long after the lights came up. Margaret waited patiently. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why do you create entertainment about your own near extinction?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "Maybe because we've come close to it so many times in reality. Ice ages, plagues, wars, natural disasters. We've been knocked down repeatedly throughout our history. And this entertains you? The getting knocked down? No." Margaret stood and stretched. "The getting back up again? That's the entertaining part." Theron returned to his quarters that night and made a note in his official diary. Preliminary assessment. Humans are technologically inferior but developing rapidly. Politically fragmented but capable of coordination. Biologically fragile but apparently unaware of this fact. Further observation required. He stared at the entry for a long moment before adding one more line. Something about this species does not fit standard categories. Requesting extension on preliminary assessment phase. Theron spent the next several weeks diving deeper into human history and culture. What he discovered left him increasingly unsettled. Late one night, he sat in his quarters reviewing Earth's geological and biological records. His data pad displayed a timeline of extinction events, climate catastrophes, and planetary upheavals. The Toba supervolcano eruption that reduced human population to merely a few thousand individuals. The ice ages that covered half the planet in frozen wasteland. Asteroid impacts. Magnetic pole reversals. Mass floods. He pulled up his homeworld's history for comparison. His planet had experienced gentle climate variations over millions of years. Abundant resources. Stable temperatures. No major extinction events in the last 50 million years. Then he reviewed the other 46 concordant species. Every single one had evolved on stable, peaceful worlds. Some had predators certainly, but nothing like Earth. Nothing even close. Earth was classified in the Concordance database as a Class 12 death world. The highest danger rating. Planets where life survived only through constant, brutal adaptation. Margaret found him the next morning, still awake, staring at his data pad. "You look terrible," she said, setting down a cup of coffee. "Did you sleep at all?" "Your planet tried to kill you," Theron said without preamble. "Repeatedly. For millions of years." Margaret sipped her own coffee. "Yes. And you survived anyway. How?" "We're stubborn," she said with a shrug. "Come on. I'm taking you somewhere." She drove him to an event called a marathon. Thousands of humans gathered at a starting line, wearing minimal clothing and numbered tags. When a signal sounded, they began running. "What is the purpose?" Theron asked, watching them stream past. "They're going to run 26 miles, Margaret explained. About 42 kilometers. Theron stared. "Why?" "To see if they can. To test themselves. Some do it for charity fundraising. Some do it just to say they did it." They watched for hours as humans pushed their bodies to absolute limits. Many collapsed at the finish line. Medical staff stood ready, treating runners for dehydration, exhaustion, and muscle failure. Yet every single one who finished wore an expression of pure triumph. "You torture yourselves for recreation," Theron said quietly. "We challenge ourselves," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." Over the following days, Margaret showed him rock climbing, where humans scaled vertical surfaces using only their hands and feet. Skydiving, where they jumped from aircraft for the thrill of falling. Deep sea diving, where they descended into crushing pressure and darkness to explore. Every activity involved unnecessary risk. "Other species have hobbies," Theron protested. "But they involve art, music, intellectual puzzles. Safe activities." "We have those too," Margaret said. "But we also like to remind ourselves what our bodies can do. What we're capable of surviving." The incident that truly shook Theron happened during his third week. An old residential building collapsed in the city center without warning. Structural failure from aging infrastructure. People were trapped inside. Theron stood with Margaret behind the safety barriers as emergency vehicles arrived. Firefighters, humans trained specifically for rescue operations, immediately rushed toward the unstable building. The structure groaned and shifted. Dust poured from cracks in the walls. "They cannot go in there," Theron said, alarmed. "The building could collapse further at any moment." "They know," Margaret said quietly. Captain James led his team into the building anyway. Theron watched in horror as they disappeared into the smoke and debris. The building shifted again. Concrete fell. Yet the humans kept going inside, kept searching. Over the next 4 hours they pulled 3 people from the wreckage. A woman and her 2 children, all alive. The firefighters emerged covered in dust and blood from minor injuries, but none seriously hurt. Theron approached Captain James afterward. You risked your life for strangers. The logical action would have been to wait for stabilization equipment. James wiped sweat and dust from his face. Those people didn't have time for logic. They had maybe an hour before the building came down completely. We had the skills and the equipment to get them out. So we did. But you could have died. Yeah, James agreed. But we didn't. And 3 people are going home tonight because we didn't let fear make the decision. That night, Theron wrote a long entry in his diary. His hands shook slightly as he typed. I have made a fundamental error in understanding humans. I believed their survival of Earth's hostile environment was luck or perhaps genetic adaptation. I was wrong. They survive because they possess something I have never encountered in another species. The ability to acknowledge danger, fully understand the risks, and then consciously choose to face it anyway. He paused, then continued typing. Every concordant species evolved fear as a survival mechanism. We fear danger so we avoid it. This is logical and has kept our species alive. But humans evolved something beyond fear. They feel fear just as intensely as any species, perhaps more so, given their biological fragility. Yet they have developed the capacity to override it when they decide something is more important than their own safety. He stopped again, staring at the words on his screen. I do not know what to call this trait. Bravery seems insufficient. Recklessness is inaccurate as they clearly calculate risks. Perhaps it is simply will, the ability to impose their decision over their instincts. A message notification interrupted his writing. It was from Concordance High Command. His chest tightened as he read it. The Vrel Imperium had begun aggressive expansion in the outer territories. Multiple Concordance worlds were threatened. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Theron was ordered to discourage any human involvement. Humanity was too young, too inexperienced. They would only get themselves killed. Theron looked at his unfinished diary entry, then back at the official message. They will want to help, he said aloud to his empty quarters. And I do not know if that terrifies me or gives me hope. Theron delivered the Concordance's message in a formal meeting with Earth's assembled military and political leaders. Margaret sat at the head of the table, along with Admiral Thomas, General Rebecca, and representatives from a dozen major nations. The Vrel Imperium has begun military expansion into Concordance territory, Theron explained, displaying a star map on the holographic projector. They are a hostile species with superior numbers and aggressive tactics. The High Council believes this conflict will escalate significantly. We are discouraging all newly integrated species from involvement. The risk is too great. Admiral Thomas leaned forward, studying the map. He was an older man with gray hair and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. What kind of ships do the Vrel use? Admiral, I must emphasize that the Concordance does not require. I understand, Thomas interrupted gently. But humor me. What kind of ships? Theron hesitated, then began describing Vrel battle cruisers, their fighter complements, their standard formations. Thomas listened intently, asking specific questions about weapon ranges, shield capabilities, and tactical doctrines. General Rebecca joined in. How do they respond to unconventional tactics? Have they encountered guerrilla warfare or asymmetric combat? They have fought the Concordance for 12 years, Theron said. They understand our strategies well. That's not what I asked, Rebecca said. The meeting ended with Earth's governments officially agreeing to remain neutral. Theron felt relieved as he filed his report to the High Council. The humans would stay safe. 3 days later, Margaret invited him to observe a military training exercise. Just so you understand what we do with our time, she said with that small smile. The facility was deep underground, carved into solid rock. Theron followed her through corridors filled with human soldiers running, training, preparing. They entered an observation room overlooking a massive chamber. Combat simulation room, Margaret explained. We can recreate almost any environment or scenario. Below them, a squad of soldiers entered the chamber. Suddenly, alarms blared. Lights went red. Smoke filled the room. Decompression scenario, a technician announced. Multiple hull breaches. Fire in compartments 3 and 7. Theron watched as the soldiers moved through the chaos. They worked in pairs, communicating through hand signals when their radios filled with static. When one soldier's oxygen tank failed, another immediately shared his own supply. They completed their objective, rescuing simulated injured crew members, in under 8 minutes. The scenario ended. The soldiers emerged sweating and exhausted. Again, the squad leader called. This time with gravity failure. They just completed the exercise, Theron protested. Surely they need rest. They need to know they can do it tired, General Rebecca said, appearing beside him. Because in real combat you don't get rest breaks. Theron spent the day watching scenarios that seemed designed to kill the participants. High-gravity burns that made his own chest ache just observing. Zero-gravity combat where humans tumbled and fought in 3 dimensions. Explosive decompression drills. Fire suppression while wearing damaged equipment. Why do you train for such extreme situations? Theron asked. The probability of encountering all these failures simultaneously is minimal. We don't train for probability, Thomas said, joining them in the observation room. We train for possibility. If something can happen, eventually it will. We prepare for the worst day imaginable, so when that day comes, we've already lived through it a dozen times in training. This is inefficient, Theron argued. You should train for the most likely scenarios. The Concordance does that, right? Rebecca asked. Train for standard combat situations. Follow established doctrines. Minimize risk. Yes. It is logical. And the Vrel have been beating you for 12 years using those same logical tactics, Rebecca said quietly. They've learned your patterns. They know what to expect. Thomas pulled up a different star map, showing recent Vrel victories. They win because they understand how you think. Your ships retreat at predetermined damage thresholds. Your fleets follow predictable formations. Your commanders make mathematically sound decisions. And this is somehow wrong? Theron asked, feeling defensive. It's not wrong, Thomas said. It just means they can predict you. They can't predict us because we don't know what we're going to do yet either. Later that evening, Margaret took Theron to a quiet restaurant. Over dinner, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. Your people trained to survive the unsurvivable, he said finally. Why? Margaret set down her fork. Because Earth taught us that the universe doesn't care about fair. Ice ages don't check if you're ready. Volcanoes don't wait for convenient timing. Predators don't give you a sporting chance. So we learned to survive anyway despite the odds, despite the circumstances. Other species evolved cooperation for survival, Theron said, repeating his own thoughts from his diary. You evolved something different. We evolved stubbornness, Margaret said with a slight laugh. The ability to look at impossible situations and say, watch me. Theron's communicator chimed. An urgent message from Concordance High Command. His hands trembled slightly as he read it. The Vrel had attacked Concordance Colony Theta. The assault was brutal and swift. Casualties were devastating. The Concordance fleet had retreated per standard doctrine, seeding the system to preserve ships and personnel. 20,000 civilians were left behind, trapped on the colony world. Theron looked up at Margaret, his expression stricken. She was already reading her own messages, her face hardening. How long until your government makes a decision? Theron asked. Margaret stood, dropping currency on the table. We already have. Admiral Thomas is mobilizing 3 ships. We launch in 6 hours. You cannot, Theron said desperately. The Vrel will destroy you. Your ships are inferior. Your crews are inexperienced in real combat. This is suicide. Margaret met his eyes. 20,000 people are about to die if nobody helps them. We have ships. We have crews willing to try. That's enough. You will all be killed. Probably, Margaret agreed. She headed for the door then paused. But maybe not. And even if we are, those 20,000 people will know someone tried. They'll know they weren't abandoned. Sometimes that matters more than survival. Theron sat alone at the table for a long moment. Then he made a decision that would likely end his career. He followed Margaret to the spaceport and requested assignment to the human fleet as an observer. Admiral Thomas raised an eyebrow when Theron appeared on the bridge. You sure about this, Ambassador? No, Theron admitted. But I need to see what happens when humans fight. Thomas smiled grimly. Then strap in. You're about to find out. The 3 human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Theta system. Theron stood on the bridge of the flagship, a vessel called the Defiant, gripping a handrail as alarms immediately began blaring. 12 Vrel warships, the scanner officer reported. They've detected us. They're moving to intercept. Admiral Thomas sat calmly in his command chair, studying the tactical display. Helen, Michael, form up on our flanks. Standard wedge formation. The other 2 human ships, the Relentless and the Phoenix, moved into position. 3 ships against 12. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Sir, they're hailing us, the communications officer said. Put them through. A harsh, clicking voice filled the bridge. The translation system rendered it into words Theron could understand. Unknown vessels. You are interfering in Vrel territorial acquisition. Withdraw or be destroyed. Thomas didn't hesitate. This is Admiral Thomas of Earth. We're here for the civilians on that colony. Let them go and we'll leave peacefully. The Vrel response was laughter, a sound like breaking glass. 3 primitive ships against the Vrel fleet? Your species must enjoy extinction. Thomas smiled coldly. You'd be surprised what we enjoy. All ships weapons free. Execute attack pattern Omega. The Defiant surged forward at maximum thrust. Theron stumbled, the acceleration pressing him against the bulkhead despite the inertial dampeners. Sir, we're exceeding safe engine parameters, the engineer called out. I know, Thomas replied. Keep pushing. The human ships didn't follow any concordance tactical doctrine Theron recognized. Instead of maintaining formation and exchanging fire at range, they dove straight into the Vrel fleet, weaving between the larger enemy vessels. Missiles away, the weapons officer announced. The Defiant shuddered as it launched its payload. But these weren't standard missiles. They exploded prematurely, releasing clouds of metallic chaff that blinded Vrel sensors. In the confusion, Captain Helen aboard the Relentless executed a maneuver that made Theron's blood run cold. She vented the ship's excess atmosphere for an emergency thrust boost, sending her ship screaming past a Vrel cruiser at point-blank range. The Relentless raked the enemy ship's hull with every weapon it had. The Vrel cruiser's shields buckled, then failed. Explosions rippled across its surface. One down, Helen reported, her voice tight. But we've got problems. Lost forward shields and primary weapons. Hull breach on deck 3. Fall back and make repairs, Thomas ordered. Negative, sir. We can still fight. The battle descended into chaos. The Vrel tried to box in the human ships using standard envelopment tactics, but the humans refused to behave predictably. They used debris fields for cover. They fired at angles that risked hitting their own ships. They executed burns that pushed their engines past safety limits. Theron watched in horror as the Phoenix took a direct hit to its engine section. The entire rear quarter of the ship exploded in flame and vapor. Phoenix is down, someone reported. But the Phoenix wasn't done. Captain Michael's voice crackled over the comm. We've lost main power and engines. But weapons are still online. David, reroute everything to the guns. Sir, that means shutting down life support, David's voice responded. The radiation shielding will fail. Do it anyway. We're not done yet. Theron couldn't believe what he was hearing. The crew of the Phoenix was choosing to die fighting rather than surrender or evacuate. For another 10 minutes, the crippled Phoenix continued firing. Its weapons cut through a Vrel destroyer before the ship finally went dark. Its crew succumbed to radiation or oxygen deprivation. Phoenix has gone silent, the communications officer said quietly. The bridge fell silent for just a moment. Then Thomas spoke, his voice hard. Make it count. Defiant, emergency turn, bearing 270. Ramming speed. Sir? The helmsman asked. You heard me. The Defiant turned and accelerated directly toward a Vrel battlecruiser. Every alarm on the ship began screaming warnings. The Vrel vessel tried to turn away, but it was too slow, too large. At the last possible second, Thomas ordered, hard port. All starboard weapons fire. The Defiant skimmed along the Vrel ship's hull, close enough that Theron could see individual hull plates through the viewport. Every weapon on the starboard side fired simultaneously at point-blank range. The Vrel shields never stood a chance. The battlecruiser broke apart, torn open from bow to stern. But the Defiant had paid a price. The ship shuddered and groaned. Explosions rippled through the lower decks. Hull breaches on multiple decks, damage control reported. Engine 3 is offline. We're venting atmosphere from the port side. Seal what you can, Thomas ordered. Helen, status? Relentless is barely holding together, Helen responded. But we're still in this fight. 6 Vrel ships remained, now circling cautiously. They'd never encountered an enemy like this. An enemy that should have retreated after the first losses but kept fighting. An enemy that used their own ships as weapons when conventional tactics failed. A young officer named Emma piloted one of the Defiant's few remaining fighters. Her cockpit had been damaged in an earlier exchange. The canopy was cracked, her oxygen supply failing. Lieutenant Emma returned to the ship, Thomas ordered. Negative, sir. There's a Vrel troop transport breaking for the colony. If it lands, those civilians are done for. Your oxygen won't last. Then I'd better be quick. Theron watched the small fighter accelerate toward the massive transport. Emma fired everything she had, targeting the transport's engines. The transport returned fire. One shot clipped Emma's fighter, sending it spinning. She corrected, lined up one final shot and fired her last missile. It struck true. The transport's engine exploded. The ship began tumbling, unable to reach the colony. Emma's fighter went dark, her oxygen finally depleted. A rescue shuttle from the Relentless retrieved her unconscious body minutes later. She would survive. The remaining Vrel ships began to retreat. They'd never retreated before, not in 12 years of fighting the Concordance. But they retreated now. Sir, Concordance reinforcements are arriving, the scanner officer announced. A fleet of 30 Concordance warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The Vrel fled the system entirely. Admiral Thomas slumped in his chair, exhausted. Around him, his bridge crew sat in stunned silence. Theron's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd watched 60% of the human force destroyed. He'd seen them use tactics that violated every principle of safe naval combat. He'd witnessed humans choose death over retreat time and time again. And they'd won. Why? Theron whispered. Why do you fight like that? Thomas looked at him with tired eyes. Because those 20,000 people down there deserved someone who wouldn't give up on them. Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. And because we're human. We don't know how to quit. Theron returned to Earth 3 weeks after the battle. The Concordance High Council had requested his immediate report on human military capabilities. What they received instead changed everything. He sat in his quarters for 2 full days, writing and rewriting his official recommendation. His hands still trembled when he thought about what he'd witnessed. The Phoenix crew dying at their stations. Emma flying with a cracked cockpit. Thomas ordering a ramming maneuver that should have killed everyone aboard. Finally, he transmitted his report. To the Honorable High Council of the Galactic Concordance. After extensive observation and direct combat experience with humanity, I submit the following assessment. Humanity is not simply another species requesting Concordance membership. They represent something we have never encountered before. He paused, reading his own words, then continued typing. Every Concordance species evolved on stable worlds where cooperation ensured survival. We developed intelligence to work together, to share resources, to avoid conflict. This made us peaceful, prosperous, and predictable. Humanity evolved on a death world where survival required constant adaptation under extreme pressure. They developed intelligence not for cooperation alone, but for problem-solving when death was the alternative. Theron stood and paced his quarters, thinking about everything he'd learned. Humans feel fear as intensely as any species. Perhaps more so, given their physical fragility. But they possess the ability to acknowledge that fear, calculate the risks, and then choose to act anyway when they decide something matters more than their own safety. I do not know what to call this quality. The humans call it courage. I call it terrifying. He returned to his desk and pulled up files he'd collected. Human literature, films, historical records, cultural artifacts. Every piece told the same story in different forms. Human culture celebrates the underdog, the impossible victory, the triumph against overwhelming odds. Their oldest myths feature individuals standing against gods and monsters. Their modern entertainment depicts ordinary people becoming extraordinary through determination alone. This is not accidental. This is who they are at their core. Margaret had scheduled a meeting with him that afternoon. They met at the same restaurant where they'd received news of the Vrel attack. The High Council wants your recommendation, Margaret said. What did you tell them? The truth, Theron replied. That humanity should be granted full Concordance membership immediately. Margaret raised her eyebrows. Just like that? No probationary period? No oversight. Just like that, Theron confirmed. But I also told them something else. He pulled up his report on his data pad and showed her the final section. I recommended that the Concordance should never, under any circumstances, make an enemy of humanity. That we should welcome you as equals, integrate your military into our defensive operations, and ensure you never have reason to turn that determination against us instead of beside us. Margaret read silently, her expression unreadable. Finally she looked up. You're afraid of us. Yes, Theron admitted. I am terrified of what humans could become if pointed in the wrong direction. But I am also grateful that you choose kindness. That you reached for the stars seeking friends rather than conquest. We're not conquerors, Margaret said softly. No, Theron agreed. You're survivors. And survivors will do whatever it takes when pushed. The galaxy is fortunate that you prefer peace. Days later, Theron attended a school play at Margaret's invitation. Her niece, a young girl named Emma, was performing in a production about Earth's historical figures. The children acted out scenes of people who changed impossible situations through determination and courage. Theron watched a child portray a scientist named Marie who discovered radioactivity despite poverty and discrimination. Another played a leader named Winston who rallied his nation during a terrible war. A third portrayed a woman named Rosa who changed unjust laws by simply refusing to accept them. Every story followed the same pattern. Ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. People who could have given up, should have given up by any logical measure but didn't. After the play, young Emma approached Theron shyly. "Did you like it, Mr. Ambassador?" "I did," Theron said honestly. "Tell me, Emma, do you think you could do what those people did? Face impossible challenges?" Emma thought about it seriously. "I don't know. But I think I'd try. That's what humans do, right? We try." That simple answer from a child summarized everything Theron had learned. Humans tried. Even when logic said failure was certain, even when the odds were impossible, even when trying meant dying. They tried anyway. That evening, Theron received official notification from the High Council. After emergency deliberation, they had accepted his recommendations. Humanity would receive full Concordance membership with equal voting rights. Human military forces would be integrated into Concordance defensive operations. And perhaps most importantly, the Council had issued a directive that humanity be treated as equal partners, not subordinates. The message included one additional note. Theron was requested to accept permanent assignment as ambassador to Earth. His experience and understanding of humanity made him irreplaceable in this role. Theron accepted without hesitation. Margaret visited him the next day with coffee and congratulations. They sat on the balcony of his residence, looking out over the human city below. "So you're stuck with us," Margaret said with a smile. "I learned too much to trust anyone else with this responsibility," Theron replied. "Besides, I find I have grown fond of your strange, terrifying species." "Strange and terrifying," Margaret laughed. "That'll look great on the tourism brochures." Theron smiled, something he'd learned from humans. "You asked me weeks ago if I still thought humans were primitive. I never gave you a proper answer. And now? Now I believe humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy who has chosen to be kind instead. You have the capacity for remarkable violence, but you prefer remarkable compassion. You could conquer but you choose to cooperate. You could take but you prefer to give." He paused, watching human children play in a park below. "I intend to spend the rest of my career ensuring that the galaxy never gives you reason to reconsider those choices. Because I have seen what you do when you fight for others. I have no desire to see what you would do if you fought for yourselves against us." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "That's quite a burden you're taking on." "It is also quite an honor," Theron replied. "You reached for the stars seeking friends. I will ensure you found them." In his final diary entry that night, Theron wrote one last observation. "Humanity has joined the Concordance. But I suspect the Concordance has changed more from this than humanity has. We evolved in gardens and called ourselves civilized. Humans evolved in hell and chose to be civilized anyway. There is a profound difference between peace that comes from never knowing war and peace that comes from knowing war and choosing differently. Humanity knows war intimately. They understand violence, sacrifice, and survival. And they chose to reach for the stars with open hands instead of closed fists. The galaxy should be grateful. I know I am." He closed his diary and looked out at the Earth sky, at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, the Vrel Imperium was retreating, confused and frightened by an enemy they couldn't understand. Somewhere out there, the Concordance was stronger because 3 human ships had refused to abandon 20,000 strangers. And somewhere out there, humanity's future was unfolding. A future where the most dangerous species in the galaxy had chosen to be its protectors instead. Theron smiled again. Yes, he was afraid of humans. But he was also proud to call them allies.